1941, Oxford University Press published a book called American Renaissance by the critic F.O. Matheson. At the beginning of this book, Matheson asks us to take a look at the books published in America between 1850 and 1855. The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, Moby Dick by Herman Melville, Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, Walden by Henry David Thoreau, and a handful of other books by people like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and more, were published in this short 5-year span. And what Matheson ends up arguing is that this mid-19th century constitutes an American Renaissance. Now, there are reasons to quibble with these dates. I mean, if you look at the, say, 5 years before that, from 1845 to 1850, you also have a host of really good books by really great writers. Edgar Allan Poe, for instance, was already dead by the 1850s, but in the late 1840s published some of his most important poems and stories. So this idea of American Renaissance, as Matheson talks about it, can kind of be broadened out to this larger view that the mid-19th century saw something really special and really foundational to American literature from that point onward. If we talk about American poetry in the American Renaissance, we're going to name some different names than Melville, Hawthorne, Emerson, and Thoreau, probably names like Walt Whitman, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Emily Dickinson, Frances Ellen Watkins are going to be more important to our conversation. And yet I want to keep this idea of American Renaissance in our minds as we move into the 19th century, because I think it's true. Something took place in the 19th century in American literature that was different fundamentally from what had happened before then. I want to start discussing the American Renaissance, not in the 1850s, but back in the 18 teens. Where we left off last time, we had been talking about how Joel Barlow had published this long, not entirely critically successful poem called The Columbiad, at first in the 1790s and then revised in the first decade of the 1800s. But by the 18 teens, the generation that had made a name for themselves, both fighting in the Revolutionary War, being involved in writing on behalf of the revolutionary cause, their generation was passing away. And a new generation of writers and thinkers was emerging in America. Now, if you want to be a writer in the 18 teens, it was difficult. There wasn't a thriving literary publishing industry in America. Oh, there were newspapers, and newspapers is, in fact, where a lot of the writers we're going to talk about got their start. But being a famous American novelist or being a famous American poet wasn't really a thing. Sure, Philip Freneau, Phyllis Wheatley had made a name for themselves a few decades before, both in America and England, for publishing a volume or two of interesting, influential poetry. But the idea that you could have a career as a poet or novelist, that wasn't really heard of yet. This begins to change in the late 18 teens with the poetry of a man named William Cullen Bryant. I want to read to you one of Bryant's most famous poems. This is called To a Waterfowl. Wither midst falling dew, while glow the heavens with the last steps of day, far through their rosy depths dost thou pursue thy solitary way. Vainly the fowler's eye might mark thy distant flight to do thee wrong, as darkly seen against the crimson sky, thy figure floats along. Seek'st thou the plashy brink of weedy lake or marge of river wide, or where the rocking billows rise and sink on the chafed ocean side? There is a power whose care teaches thy way along that pathless coast, the desert and illimitable air, lone wandering, but not lost. All day thy wings have fanned, at that far height, the cold, thin atmosphere, yet stoop not weary to the welcome land, though the dark night is near. And soon that toil shall end. Soon shalt thou find a summer home and rest, and scream among thy fellows, reed shall bend, soon, o'er thy sheltered nest. Thou art gone, The abyss of heaven hath swallowed up thy form. Yet on my heart deeply hath sunk the lesson thou hast given, and shall not soon depart. He who, from zone to zone, guides through the boundless sky thy certain flight, in the long way that I must tread alone, will lead my steps aright. This poem was published in 1818, and William Cullen Bryant proved in this and other poems that American poetry wasn't gone, wasn't all used up in its genius or in its subjects by the Revolution. This is what we might call a very romantic poem. Romanticism had already blossomed in the late 1700s in places like Germany and places like England with Wordsworth and Coleridge and Blake and others. And in England, in the 18 teens, a new generation of romantics, people like Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, John Keats, Lord Byron, had already made a name for themselves as writers of poems that were attending to nature, but also trying to draw morals from nature, look at how the natural world worked, and then extrapolate, okay, what does this mean for the heart of man, for the life of man? And Bryant really taps into this, but gives us an American scene. It's a waterfowl. He's watching this bird flying. And he has just this lovely, it sounds like a British romantic poem, whither midst falling dew. It's kind of old-fashioned sounding to us. The wording is very precise, and though we might feel like, oh, I've kind of heard this diction before, the choices he makes are really interesting. He who from zone to zone guides through the boundless sky thy certain flight. Boundless sky, that we might expect, but certain flight, I think that certain is very, very wisely chosen. It doesn't feel cliche. There's a certainty to the flight of the bird that then gets extrapolated into the heart of man. He who guides thy certain flight in the long way that I must tread alone will lead my steps aright. There's this assumption, I think it's a hard-won assumption, that providence, which guides the birds, will guide the speaker. There's a theological aspect to this, but it's not sectarian. He's not saying, Jesus Christ or the Archangel Michael. He's saying, hey, there's a power whose care teaches thy way along that pathless coast. This is something we find in the Romantics a lot, both in the Germans and especially the British, this idea that there's some power, some spirit guiding nature. This connects to some of the philosophies that are going around, especially Hegel, who has this idea of the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the age or the world spirit, which guides history and man. There is a power, Bryant says, as an American, that guides the waterfowl themselves. And that power will guide us well, too. It's both comforting, there's some consolation in it, but there's an acknowledgement that our way isn't easy, right? He says, in the long way that I must tread alone will guide my steps aright. It's a beautiful poem. A 20th century critic later would say that it might be the most perfect poem in American literature. I don't know if I agree with that. There's a lot of good poems. In fact, let's look at a few others. A poet that comes of age soon after Bryant is Edgar Allan Poe. Now, Bryant was from New England, and we're going to see a lot of writers from New England in this American Renaissance era. But Poe wasn't from New England. Poe spent most of his life in the South, especially in Charleston, South Carolina. He even served in the military for a while in Charleston. And Poe, if you know anything about his life story, he's down on his luck a lot. He has some problems with substance abuse. He doesn't have great relationships with women. Poe is kind of this model, a little bit like Byron and Shelley in England, of this kind of counterculture writer, this one who doesn't agree with the morals of his age, with the expectations of his age, who can't seem to quite get his life in order. And it's not just that he's a lazy person or an overindulgent person. There's something in his spirit that seems to be rebelling against the polite expectations of his age. Now, some people see that and say, oh, yeah, he's a hero. And some people see that and say, oh, here's a man who couldn't really get his life together, and that's sad. Whatever you think of Poe, Poe wrote a body of poetry that I think is both made possible and inspired by things like what Bryant did, but brings us into an even more American and Gothic sensibility. The Gothic had already begun in England. The Gothic and Romanticism are kind of intermeshed with each other. Let's look at a poem where we see a little bit of the American Gothic in Edgar Allan Poe. So this poem is called Sonnet to Science. Science, true daughter of old time thou art, who alterest all things with thy peering eyes, who prayest thou thus? Why prayest thou thus upon the poet's heart, vulture whose wings are dull realities? How should he love thee, or how deem thee wise, who wouldst not leave him in his wandering, to seek for treasure in the jeweled skies, albeit he soared with an undaunted wing? Hast thou not dragged Diana from her car, and driven the Hamadryad from the wood, to seek a shelter in some happier star? Hast thou not torn the Naiad from her flood, the elfin from the green grass, and from me the summer dream beneath the tamarind tree? There's a few things that I want to look at in this sonnet. It's very famous, probably the most famous sonnet by Poe, and it really is a sonnet. It's highly structured. The rhythm is great. Poe is always fantastic with his rhythms. His rhymes are crisp. Art, eyes, heart, realities. Maybe that's a little bit of a slant rhyme. Wise, wandering, skies, wing, car, wood, star, flood, me, tree. He knows how to write a Shakespearean sonnet. But Poe is giving us something that's both romantic and I would argue a bit Gothic, right? It's not just, I look at nature and I learn about sort of a moral, comforting lesson from it. Poe is in particular poking at the Enlightenment. This is to science, especially the science of the late Enlightenment, this idea that, our reason by looking at things, we'll truly understand how the world works. Poe is saying, look, you are a vulture whose wings are dull realities. You make things dull. And then he goes and he gets almost into this fantasy realm. He says, you have dragged Diana from her car. Diana, of course, the goddess of the hunt, the goddess of the moon in Roman mythology. You've pulled Diana out of the moon. It's just now a rock. You've driven the Hamadryad from the wood. The spirits of the wood, they're all gone. You've pushed them aside. You tore the Naiad from the flood. The water, the trees, the heavenly bodies. You've ripped away all the spirits, the mythological and fantastic beings that used to be present. Maybe were even a little spooky and scary to us, but at least kind of gave us this enchantment. You've pulled them all away. And then, this is so Poe. The elfin from the green grass, and from me the summer dream beneath the tamarind tree. The tamarind tree kind of gives us a sense of sort of a more southern climate, right? This isn't the northern pines. This is the southern tamarind. And he said, I too had a dream and you pulled it from me. It's almost the opposite of what's going on in Bryant. He's saying, hey, I look at nature and I learn that I will be guided by the same providence. Poe is saying science has made it impossible for me to dream and have sort of this fantastic world of elves and spirits and gods and goddesses. I can't learn from nature, and science is responsible. It's sad. It's the sort of romantic criticism, indictment even, of science. This was published in 1929 or 1829, and it gives us a sense, a decade or so on, of how this romantic frame of mind is staying in American poetry, but morphing and adapting into something a little darker. 10 years on, another poet comes of age, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and he's going to continue this kind of dark romantic tradition, and yet end up being a little bit more Bryant-y than he is Poe-y. In fact, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Edgar Allan Poe knew of each other and wrote letters back and forth. Poe would harshly criticize Longfellow's early poetry in print, and Longfellow would send Poe money because he knew he was down on his luck. That's what that relationship was. But both Poe and Longfellow suffered hardship in life. Longfellow's first wife died soon after they were married. And in 1839, he writes the Psalm of Life. Now, we've talked about the Psalm of Life on this channel before, but I want to quote for you a little bit of it now. This is written around 1838, published 1839. This is called a Psalm of Life. What the heart of the young man said to the psalmist. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. For the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not as they seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust to art, to dust return us, and was not spoken of the soul. Art is long and time is fleeting, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still like muffled drums are beating funeral marches to the grave. So we have a little bit in these opening stanzas of, like, look, death is coming for us, and we see the fleetingness of time, but we want to kind of cry out against, those who would say, oh, yes, death is coming, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's all very sad, and you should despair. He said, no, tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. So it's kind of this rallying against ultimate despair. Don't just end with, they've taken from me the summer dream beneath the tamarind tree. Give me some sort of hope. And in the final stanzas, it does give us some hope. Longfellow says, trust no future, however present. Let the dead past bury the dead. Act in the living present. Heart within and God o'erhead. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footsteps in the sands of time. Footsteps that perhaps another, sailing o'er life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother, seeing will take heart again. Let us then be up and doing, with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. So there's this kind of grim, some people have seen optimism, some people have seen stoicism. It's certainly sort of a stiff upper lip, no, we're going to get through it, but also we're going to get through it through maybe achieving something sublime and leaving behind us a pattern that others can follow. So Bryant is seeing in nature in 1818 a pattern that nature is following, that he can learn from, that he trusts will guide him. We see Poe saying, but look, we're up against this sort of scientific age which tries to pull from us the magic and beauty of nature. And yet, in 1839 with Psalm of Life, we have Longfellow saying, yeah, look, it might be an empty dream, but darn it, I'm not going to choose that. I want a poetry, I want a literature, I want a writing public and a reading public who don't believe the despair. So this is kind of a 20-year movement from Bryant to Poe to Longfellow. And Longfellow would go on to write a poetry about, sad, difficult things that happen to people, whether it's Evangeline or the Song of Hiawatha or the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. But ultimately, these keep being stories that show the determinedness of his main characters. And as I've argued in a previous book, The Heroines of Henry Longfellow, I think Longfellow particularly is interested in the heroism of women. Poe, on the other hand, is interested in beautiful women who die too young and men who then wreck their lives mourning them. Now, that might sound like I am criticizing Poe, and I have little patience for Poe's, men mourning women in sort of a self-indulgent, I think overly infantilizing way toward the women. But that's neither here nor there. My own taste toward Poe. Poe gives us a vision, both in the Sonnet to Science and in poems like The Raven and Annabel Lee, of men who are really struggling with despair in life at the passing of beauty. And that is a really important note in sort of the beginning of this American Renaissance. There's another note that we should talk about before we finish up this section, and that's the note that, as much as it's sad to look at the Enlightenment and see that science is maybe taking away the magic of the world, as much as it's sad that we experience, tragedy in our life from day to day, there is a gigantic tragedy being willfully caused by Americans, and this tragedy is American slavery. And this is something that Longfellow starts writing about in the 1840s, alongside perhaps the most important American poet when it comes to slavery and writing against slavery. And this is the poet Frances Ellen Watkins. Sometimes you'll also see her name as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Harper is a married name that she sort of starts writing under after she gets married. I want to read to you from an 1840s poem called Ethiopia. Yes, Ethiopia yet shall stretch her bleeding hands abroad. Her cry of agony shall reach the burning throne of God. The tyrant's yoke from off her stiff neck, her fetters from her soul, the mighty hand of God shall break and spurn their vile control. Redeemed from dust and freed from chains, her sun shall lift their eyes. From cloud-capped hills and verdant plains shall shouts of triumphs rise. Upon her dark, despairing brow shall play a smile of peace, for God hath bent unto her woe and bade her sorrows cease. 'Neath sheltering vines and stately palms shall laughing children play, and aged sires with joyous psalms shall gladden every day. Secure by night and blessed by day shall pass her happy hours, nor human tigers hunt for prey within her peaceful bowers. Then Ethiopia stretch, oh stretch thy bleeding hands abroad. Thy cry of agony shall reach and find redress from God. This is published in the 1840s by Frances Ellen Watkins, and as a black woman, as a woman who saw the ravages of slavery, this is very hopeful. And there's this, God will redress the enslavement of Ethiopia. Now, you might ask, why Ethiopia? Were there even slaves in America from Ethiopia? Ethiopia at this time, we see this in Phyllis Wheatley too. Ethiopia was kind of a stand-in for all Africans. Ethiopian was used in that sort of general sense of Ethiopian African. I get that it's not technically geographically correct, but Ethiopia was seen as a stand-in. One of the things that I think Watkins shows is this sort of possible future of free, blissful existence, 'neath sheltering vines and stately palms. Once again, we have that kind of southern flora imagery. Shall laughing children play, and aged sires with joyous psalms shall gladden every day. This is a very positive vision, but it's one that wouldn't come to be for at least another 20 years. And even then, after the freeing of the slaves, which we'll talk about in a future video, it would be an uphill battle. People like Frederick Douglass, people like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, people like the poet John Greenleaf Whittier were standing alongside people like Frances Harper in writing poems and prose against slavery. Now, as we move up toward the 1850s, sort of the American Renaissance proper, according to F.O. Matheson, we begin to see a really big change in American poetry. And that change is, I think, most seen in the writings of Walt Whitman. Now, Walt Whitman, similar to Poe, he worked in publishing. Walt Whitman is a New Yorker and very proud of his New York heritage. If we kind of have to give some geography here, Whitman, he's not as southern as Poe, but not quite as New England as Bryant and Longfellow. He's kind of in the middle. And he even spent some time in his early writing career in New Orleans and had a little bit of this sort of like, I've been to the West, I wear a cowboy hat swagger. And in 1855, Walt Whitman publishes a collection called Leaves of Grass with this central poem, Song of Myself. And it's so different from the poetry that I just read you that some people had a hard time even reconciling themselves to the fact that it could be called poetry. I want to give you a taste of it. I celebrate myself, and what I assume you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. Houses and rooms are full of perfumes. The shelves are crowded with perfumes. I breathe the fragrance myself, and I know it and like it. The distillation would intoxicate me also, but I shall not let it. The atmosphere is not a perfume. It has no taste of distillation. It is odorless. It is for my mouth forever. I am in love with it. Will go to the bank by the wood and become undisguised and naked. I am mad for it to be in contact with me. Very different than Francis Watkins. What's going on? Where's the rhyme? I guess houses and rooms are full of perfumes is a little rhymey, but there's no rhyme. There's no sort of stately, old-fashioned diction. The lines on the page, some are really short, some are really long. Also, some of what he's talking about is a little uncouth. He's talking about going skinny dipping in the river. Is this entirely okay? Emily Dickinson later in the 19th century would write in a letter that she never read Whitman because she heard it was improper for ladies to read Whitman. But you can see that there's a beautiful focus on nature. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. I breathe the fragrance myself. I know it and like it. The distillation would intoxicate me also. We have sort of this high and low language, distillation and intoxicate, very kind of fancy multisyllabic Latin words. But then you have we have the word loaf, which is kind of a slangy word. What's going on here? Well, let's look at the end of the 1855 version of Song of Myself and kind of see where he's headed with this poem. It's hundreds and hundreds of lines long. This is a very famous ending. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. I concentrate toward them that are nigh. I wait on the door slab. Who has done his day's work and will soonest be through with his supper? Who wishes to walk with me? Will you speak before I am gone? Will you prove already too late? The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp o'er the roofs of the world. The last scuds of day hold me back. It flings my likeness after the rest, and true as any on the shadowed wilds. It coaxes me to the vapor and the dusk. I depart as air. I shake my white locks at the runaway sun. I effuse my flesh in eddies and drift in lacy jags. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nevertheless, and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere waiting for you. This direct address to the reader, this kind of like, oh, am I hard to understand? Cool. I contradict myself. I contain multitudes. Both Ralph Waldo Emerson, the philosopher, and a new generation of poets and readers in the 1850s and later would see Whitman as kind of a very explicitly American voice. This isn't a voice that's hoity-toity. This isn't a voice that is trying to imitate the old, Shakespearean sonnet forms like we have with Poe, or even the more sort of explicitly romantic forms that people like Harper and Longfellow and Bryant are imitating. This is the American voice. This is the democratic voice, right? He's going to tell you about swimming in the river, right? He's going to talk about the hawks. He's gonna say, look, I don't always even make sense to myself, and that's okay. And also, he's the one who's going to very explicitly and intimately talk to the reader. Hey, I'm waiting for you somewhere. People have discerned at the end of Song of Myself a bit of a prophetic stance, right? Whitman is kind of the everyman, just telling us about his day, telling us about, what he's into today, but maybe it'll be different tomorrow. But there's also this sense that he kind of speaks for us, right? In calling this the Song of Myself, he's saying, hey, what I assume, you assume. What is true of me is true of you. I speak for all of us. I'm the American democratic poet. And that's how he would ultimately be remembered. In 1855, when this is first published, it doesn't become a smash hit, but the literati start reading it and saying, ooh, something new is going on in Whitman. And with Whitman's Leaves of Grass, published in 1855, we kind of are now up to this great era of ferment that is talked about as the American Renaissance. Something was going to happen, though. We were going to have a civil war, and it was going to change the careers of the poets who wrote before it and spawn a new concerns and new genius that would come after.